Welcome to episode 1 of History from a New Perspective, a new history channel and podcast covering the history and historical stories from parts of the world which don't always get as much attention. My name is Joseph Keane, and today we'll be looking at the history of Africa. Now, I've been speaking to the historian, anthropologist, writer and author Luke Pepera about his book Motherland, a journey through 500,000 years of African history. Now, this was an absolutely gigantic project to cover the history and culture of the African continent over such a huge time span. He told me about ideas ranging from matriarchal society to ancestral veneration, and a bit about some of the most famous stories from the motherland's long history. I started by asking him why he decided to tackle this difficult task.
I'd always had an inkling, and I'd always known that African history and the history of African peoples, African culture, went much deeper than the last 300 years that we tend to focus on, especially regarding the transatlantic slave trade and colonialism, which tend to be the topics we focus on when talking about Africa. And with the best available and the best known archaeological, genetic, linguistic evidence, we know almost certainly for a fact that Homo sapiens and human beings originated in Africa. Our species, sapiens, goes back if you look at the archaeological evidence, around 200,000 years, but some sort of paleoarchaeologists and anthropologists reckon that our species emerged 500,000 years ago. And the way they define our species is when our brain size when our brain reached a certain size relative to our bodies, is how they define our species, and that happens around 500,000 years ago, which is why I chose that as it's debatable, but I chose that as a time span because it was nice and it was well rounded, going back 500,000 years. But human beings originated in Africa within the last 300 years, but everything that goes back at least 500,000 years ago, and potentially even more. I mean, our oldest human ancestor, Sahelanthropus chidensis, is 7 million years old. That all constitutes, that is all African history. That is all the history of African peoples and the peoples on the continent. And so I just wanted to give people a sense that there was so much happening on the continent, and there was so much history happening beyond the last 300 years. And to really drive that point home, I wanted to expand the time span as long as I could.
Let's skip forward now many years. One of the things that you mentioned was your grandfather's funeral. Just tell us about sort of African conceptions of life, death, and the ancestors. How does it differ from Europe, for example?
In African cultures, it is believed that death isn't the end. I think when in Europe, and particularly in Western Europe, death is sort of seen as an absolute cessation of living. Yes, we have ideas about the afterlife, but it's something that is removed from and is distinct from the mortal realm, from the world that we're all now in. In Africa, death is simply a transition. It's almost like it's more akin to puberty more generally. All it is a transition from the mortal realm to the spiritual realm. But the connection between those who transition and those who pass on, they are called or generally referred to as the living dead. And they're called the living dead because that connection between the living world isn't broken. In fact, in many African cultures, the way we conceive of the spirit world is that it sort of rests on top of, it's like an invisible cloth upon a table. It's actually the phrase I use in the book. It sort of rests on top of the mortal world, and spirits exist all around us. Or those who have passed on, those who have died, they actually exist all around us, but they've taken on the form of spiritual beings, so they are invisible to us unless they want to make themselves seen. But they still exist, and actually we can talk to them, we can communicate with them. They often still give us some advice and guidance, and they affect our lives in multiple ways. So it's actually just generally this idea of the community continuing to exist and the bonds that are created between community members in life continuing on after death. And there are various ways in which that continuation and also that communication exists. I mean, one of the reasons I talk about my grandpa's funeral is because I saw, he passed away in 2020, it was around about 2013, 2012, 2013. And one of the things that I noticed when I went to his we had his funeral proceedings and, when we were burying him, is that, there were ways in which, I came across an artifact in his ancestral home, in the home that he grew up in, which he grew up. And in my culture, the Akan of Ghana, we have what are known as stools, and they are, sort of as they're described, they're sort of these wooden artifacts, usually made of a top and a middle and the base, and the middle can usually be carved into some kind of symbolic symbol, which represents something. It's a symbol of like a proverb or a story, but essentially the belief is that when someone every family has one of these stools, and when someone in the family dies, and the community dies, it is believed that their soul moves into the stool and inhabits the stool. And in order to communicate with the ancestors, all you have to do is either sort of perform a ritual that involves the stool, or even just having some kind of contact with it, physical contact. And there was a interesting power, and it was also quite emotional, being near the stool and feeling after my grandfather had died, and finding some comfort, but also finding some reality in that conception that he still existed, but just within this artifact. And actually not just him, but the all of my ancestors, all of those ancestors who passed away, still existed within this artifact, and I only needed to touch it to kind of feel that connection with them.
Another important concept in Africa's history and culture is the idea of the Queen Mother and matriarchal figures and rulers. Just tell us a bit about this, using the example of the ancient kingdom of Kush in modern Egypt and Sudan.
Kush, or sometimes it's referred to as Nubia, is what's now southern Egypt and northern Sudan, and it was actually the reference. So it actually referred to the landmass, essentially like a bounded landmass, what we would call nowadays a country, essentially. But within that country, there were three kingdoms. Kerma, which is the most ancient kingdom, which dates back to 5,000 years ago. Napata, which was the second kingdom, which was around about 1,000 BC is when it was at its peak, at its heyday. And then Meroe, which existed from about 300 BC to 300 AD, roundabouts. And in that culture, women had always been important. So, for example, in Kerma, in the kingdom of Kerma, they had been priestesses, and they performed important rituals that helped the king assert his legitimacy and also enhanced the king's legitimacy. They were kind of an interface or a conduit between him and the gods as well. In Napata, women continued to be important, but also especially because of the Nubians' interactions with Egypt back and forth, they borrowed a lot from each other, from funerary rites to religious systems, to writing, and in Nubia, one of the things that perhaps is adopted is the cult of Isis. That figure Isis, who raises her son Horus to become the king after Osiris is killed by his brother Set, as sort of the Egyptian mythology goes. She's seen as an incredibly foundational, important, and crucial figure. And the mothers of the kings in Napata, particularly that kingdom, but I think in Nubia, were basically seen as Isis, and their sons were seen as Horus. So they had that. They had, as it were, that kind of divine connection, and that divine representation, being seen as Isis on earth. But what happens is that the founder as well of the Napatan dynasty, so essentially the kingdom of Napata, this Nubian king called Alara, actually switches up the governmental and also the system by which new kings are chosen and new kings are selected. We think that before that it might have been maybe closer to what you see in let's say in Western Europe in the medieval era, this idea of like primogeniture, maybe the oldest son, or at least the son who's kind of the most capable, most militarily capable. But Alara changes it so that essentially that what happens is that for a new king to be elected, it would either be when the old king dies, then a new king is selected. It's not automatically the deceased king's son or children or first son. It's actually a king can be selected amongst that dead king's sister's sons, so basically his nephews. And what happens is that the generals of Napata, of Kush, all the important people, the generals and the officials, they get together and discuss who the most suitable candidate would be. And once they select a person, then that king's mother, so this could be, the dead king's sister, she becomes what's known as the queen mother, who is essentially the most important person in the kingdom, and she has a very important role when it comes to the coronation. So what happens is that when a new king is selected, one of the things that he has to do is go around the temples and all the important cities in Kush. These are the temples of the god Amun, another important Egyptian god who the Nubians kind of adopt, and they sort of change how he functions a little bit to make him their own. But he has to go to all the temples of Amun in important cities, and there he's essentially there. There's a huge like sort of week-long ritual, week-long festival or feast, and a statue of Amun is carried through the crowd, and this is supposed to sort of symbolize Amun's acceptance of this prince as the new king. But he can't yet become the new king unless his mother, the new queen mother, also goes to the temple and essentially gives a speech symbolically to Amun, saying, will you accept my son as the next king of Kush? And actually, we actually have artistic representations of this ritual, where the queen mother is depicted alongside her son, and it was something that was absolutely critical to become a new king of Kush. The queen mother's role, not just generally because often, becoming the queen mother and as the king was ruling, she would often be the one to advise him. The previous king mother, so the mother of this deceased king, had an outsized role in helping to select the new candidate. But actually, with this ritual, she's absolutely essential for the creation of the new king in the first place. And without her, no new king can actually rule legitimately. And all of this just goes to demonstrate the importance of women in this culture. And in fact, and they again, they're so important to Napata that actually by memory, they are ruling in their own right. Either sometimes they're ruling, they are sole rulers, and they do have either a husband, a king, or a son. Who might, after they pass away or after some sort of governmental changes, come to rule in his own right. But actually, they are autocrats. They go to war. Some of them even have representations in stelae, which depict them smiting enemies, which is an old Egyptian motif demonstrating power. And they're sort of depicted as these like really large women with long fingernails, decked out in bedecked jewelry. They're absolutely decked out, but I think that also demonstrates that there wasn't, it's not like, for example, some of the Egyptian female pharaohs who have to be depicted as men. These women sort of reveling and relishing in their femininity, but that doesn't mean they also can't be powerful leaders, powerful autocrats, and powerful warriors.
Just moving to an example of a famous male ruler now in African history. So Mansa Musa was the 14th century emperor of Mali, and of course he embarked on his famous pilgrimage to Mecca. Why do you think this story has caught the imagination, and why has it become so famous?
I mean, the Mansa Musa as an emperor, like you say, is incredibly famous, and the defining moment probably of his life, and one of the defining moments in African history is this pilgrimage. And I think the reason it's so famous is basically just because of the sheer scale of it. In order to perform this pilgrimage, he wasn't the first emperor, Mali emperor, by any stretch of the imagination to complete a pilgrimage to Mecca. Mali had been Muslim, or at least the elites had been Muslim since the 11th or 12th centuries, perhaps even a little bit before. And it was one of the things emperors did as sort of faithful Muslims, as pious Muslims, and also wanting to demonstrate their legitimacy as Muslim states. But Musa, for whatever reason, I think it's because he has this intense interest in the empire itself and in raising its profile. And I think it's because Musa wants to make us as the most extreme, the most extravagant, the most splendid anyone has ever seen. So he gathers together 60,000 of his subjects, 15,000 camels, all of which he laden with 100 kilograms of gold, before he travels. But I think also one of the reasons the pilgrimage is really well known, or perhaps the main reason, is that when he gets to Egypt as well, he gifts so much gold, and all the pilgrims spend so much gold in Egypt that they crash the economy, they crash the gold economy, and gold floods the market and inflation increases, and this doesn't just affect the gold market or the markets of Cairo, but it affects those of Africa and Asia and even Europe as well. So three continents were affected by this person moving through. So stories essentially just proliferate of a individual and also of a society that was so wealthy that they could cause huge fluctuations in the most, arguably the most important commodity in history in the world. Because of those stories and because of the proliferation of those tales of Musa's largesse, he is depicted even on a European map, but just only about 40 years after his death as well, by Abraham Cress. It's a map commissioned by Charles V, and he's described as the richest king in all the land, and he's holding a gold nugget. So I think it was just the scale of his wealth, the scale of his pilgrimage, and actually some of the events that occurred on that pilgrimage that meant that his name was world renowned.
Now, skipping forward now a few years, so often when people do talk about the history of Africa, they refer to the period of slavery, colonialism, and the roots of modern racism. But you gave the example of Virginia in the 1600s and spoke about a time before these ideas had taken root.
Yeah, so I think especially in early Virginia, because it was such a mixed society, you had not only for example, African indentured servants, so people who would be are given food and board essentially to work on a plantation for a few years and then be set free. But you also had European. I mean, they're very common to have European, like Irish, and sometimes even Scottish indentured servants as well. But you also had European and African landowners. So this idea of a class-based, racially based class system didn't exist in early Virginia because society was so mixed, because you had people interacting on different levels and people of different backgrounds who existed in different stratas of society. And it's actually because of a demographic shift that occurs with a huge the increased importation of enslaved Africans to Virginia that you start to see essentially fewer and fewer African landowners and also European indentured servants, because a lot of them are being freed. But what you basically see are just white landowners or European landowners and enslaved Africans. And it is that then there begins to exist in the mind a conflation between Africanness and servitude, and between Europeanness, power, wealth, and land holding. So that's essentially what I think one of the key reasons these ideas of African inferiority and essentially these ideas of racism occur and come about because of that demographic shift, which changes the Americas and case that I use in the book, particularly Virginia, into a race-based class system. It's not something really that happens even in the rest of Europe. At this time in the 17th, 18th centuries, you have Africans in Europe who reach the highest strata of society. I mean, numerous examples. The one I use in the book is Alessandro de Medici, who's half African. He becomes, the first Duke of Florence in the Renaissance, in the Renaissance period. There's also Ganibal Petrovich, who's the great grandfather of Alexander Pushkin, Russia's national poet as well, who's adopted by Peter the Great, and he becomes a nobleman and a courtier. Thomas Alexandre Dumas, the father of Alexandre Dumas, the writer of the Three Musketeers and the Count of Monte Cristo, who's a formidable general in Napoleon's army, for instance. And that's the 18th century, in the late 18th century. I think that's what then leads to one thinking that actually, okay, so it's something particular that is happening in society, some particular circumstances that are leading then to these ideas of African inferiority, and actually in the pockets where those circumstances don't exist, and in that case I'm referring to those demographic shifts, you actually have up until really the 19th and even the 20th centuries, this idea of generally of inherent African inferiority doesn't exist. I mean, that then changes with certain people who are writing in the 19th century, most particularly those who own plantations in the West Indies, who during the time of abolition fear those plantations being wrested away from them. And one of the strategies they use in order to prevent that is to say that Africans are naturally inferior and subservient, and therefore it is, they were basically born to be enslaved. So it's not a crime, it's not wrong or a crime to do so. It's the natural order of things. And in order to prove that, they try and come up with evidence, so often, and use pseudoscience to demonstrate Africans' inherent inferiority. And it's those ideas that form then the basis of the modern racism that we see today, and this idea about a ranking of races, and of Africans being at the bottom, and there's something inherent in being an African, and that means you are the lowest kind of of human being, essentially. But that's actually a lot later than we think. Even the ancient world, it didn't exist. In the medieval world, it doesn't exist. In the early modern period, it doesn't exist.
Now, the history of the transatlantic slave trade is, of course, a complex one. Take us to the kingdom of Dahomey in modern-day Benin and its ruler, King Agaja. Tell us about this relationship he had with the trade and some of the difficulties that he faced.
Agaja is an interesting figure. He's sort of in the historical record. He's sort of to be this. He's described as this great general. He's very charismatic. He's very brave. But essentially, he has a lot of the kingdoms are around him. So, Dahomey is sort of slightly towards the north of Monde Benin, and those that were closest to the coast, especially the kingdoms of Ouida and Alada, were much more interested in the trading of slaves and having those closer relations with Europeans, whereas Agaja, because of what had happened with his ancestors, particularly the founder of Dahomey, Dogba Gregenu, he'd essentially been kicked out of. He was actually a prince of Alada, and he essentially had been the Dutch had helped him be kicked out of Alada, which is why he'd had to move north, and which is why he founded Dahomey. So the Dahomeans had always been mistrustful and also resentful of the Europeans, and Agaja was very much in that vein. So what happens is that during his reign, he basically conquers all of the kingdoms, across the coast, and it's as though he has this grand plan to try and put a stop to the trade. So after he conquers the kingdoms, he sets up blockades. He makes it very difficult for the Europeans to trade. He sets tighter regulations. He avoids Europeans from going to other kingdoms, and it's all to do with stymieing a trade, which he feels, and stymieing a people and societies, which he feels have caused him and his people so much harm in the past. That's essentially why he seems to do it.
Now, of course, the history of slavery in Africa is hugely important, but it's not the full story. Why do you think, in general, we don't understand the history of Africa as well as we do other parts of the world?
I think the reasons for that are twofold. I think one is that not a lot of research has yet been done on the continent because of a lot of, especially the political and economic growing pains the relatively new countries of that continent have been going through. It's meant that historical, archaeological, and anthropological research and exploration has kind of been put on the back burner, hasn't been as prioritized. So I think the material isn't there that has inspired people then to do books and documentaries and TV series and that kind of thing. Meaning that a lot of African culture it's not known generally in the culture. It's not something that's sort of become received or sort of popular knowledge, like popular wisdom. But I think also, there were challenges that especially a lot of early Africanist archaeologists and historians, for instance, faced when trying to research this history, which was that a lot of the early European researchers were convinced that a lot of the stuff they found in Africa could not have been made by Africans. So that was an initial hurdle that we had to overcome, and whether that was the 14th century bronze heads of the Ife Kingdom of what's now Nigeria to the medieval stone city of Great Zimbabwe and what's now Zimbabwe. A lot of these artifacts and a lot of these sites were reckoned to have been made by other people. Some early European researchers going so far as to say they were made by, if not Arabs and Chinese, then Atlanteans. And it's only really in living memory, from the mid 20th century onwards, in some cases even the late 20th century onwards, that it's even been accepted, started to be generally accepted in academic circles that actually this is the history of the African people, and that's what needs to be known. So I think also more funding and research when it comes to African history. We've already kind of overcome that hurdle, I think, of thinking that Africans couldn't have made these things, but there is still a long way to go in terms of properly researching and properly preserving the history and also sharing the history as widely as possible. I mean, now it's great because you have archaeology or history programs in African universities where people are concerned with telling the story of their countries and of their people. which I think is going to be great for getting the story wider. But that's but even traditionally, I'll say in Africa, the path wasn't to for most people, it wasn't seen as being fully respected. If you went down the historical path, you'd more likely be pushed into the path of being a vocational path of being a lawyer or a doctor, or whatever it was. But now history is seen as something valid and engaging and something people could be passionate about. And as they continue to research and to share their research, and as that research then inspires people, for example, in popular culture films, etc., then I think that's when we'll start to see African history more generally known.
So that was Luke Pepera there speaking to me about the history of Africa. And we'll be looking at some of these events in different areas of the continent in greater depth in future episodes. But please see links in the description for more information on Luke's book, Motherland, A Journey Through 500,000 Years of African History, which is available as an ebook and in all good bookstores. So thank you so much for joining us today on History from a New Perspective, and we'll see you in the next episode.